What's the deal? This your boy Cakes Da Killa, along with my right-hand man, Proper Villains. We just want to give a special shout-out to everybody at NCLR who's fighting for poor LGBT Black members of the community, people like me who look like me, talk like me, act like me, giving us a chance to, go blossom and shine in the world. So I'm going to do a throwback for y'all off one of my first projects, Hedonism. So let's do it.
What we gonna do right here is go back. Way back.
Okay.
Back into time.
Let's go.
Hey, you, blow your whistle.
Ooh.
Now clap your hands and say, yeah.
Okay.
Now let me count it off.
Here we go.
1, 2, 3. It's the beat.
Ooh. Like ooh. Just pump the beat, yo, 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 just touch of love, a little bit, just touch of love, a little bit, yeah. I'm screaming, get low with it, get low with it, get low. I can't get low because I'll be out of frame, but I can't stop. But if you a bad bitch, get low with it. Got tips, son, get low with it, get low with it, get low with it, get low with it, get low. Young God on the go, make that money or the block or the pole. Let me make it hot since hitters came cold. Backside on slip, run your waist like so. I leave your man's on hold, I'ma pull a Carfax cause he really tryna roll. This shit I'm finna blow.
Like
yo, it's a mix of squats in my sit-ups, digging in my kitty cat, trying to get my. Let me drink a shot, see how quick a bitch. Linking me to them, but they really ain't stack up. Cuffing to blocking, I'm whipping and whopping. Keep it rotates, I'm shipping and shopping. Won't slip and won't be forgotten. I'm here to make it hot. Yo, you ain't doing shit though. I'm so sick like motherfucking Crisco, trying to go platinum like the waves up on Cisco. Double that, triple that, strapping out the bando. Stack that, flip that, trophies on a mantle. On vacate down in the sandal. With a goo build tough like Rambo. Cakes the beast, Kenyon. Make them dollars hold advance on the feet. And I'm booked down for a breeze on the cheek. Bouncing on the piece, guess he really want a piece. What type of bitch do you want me to be? What type of stunts is you playing to see? I can make a blaze raise at 10 degrees, got you weak in the knee. Out of your league when I'm off on that E. Sweating out your socks and your Chris Dundees. Lost your style trying to get it like me. Just a minor pet peeve when I'm feeling sexy. Stars in my DM trying to run game. Pop my spine now. I maintain now. I'm insane now. All in my brain like 5, 6, 7, 8 like. Just pump the beat. Just pump the beat. Just a little cardio. Just pump the beat. Turn it up, turn it up, turn it up now. Turn it up now. Yo, turn it up now. Turn it up now. All around the world like, yo, this shit gon' blow. This shit gon' blow. Yo, 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 this shit gon' blow.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4,
3, 2, murder, 1 lyric at your door.
Okay, John with the tricks. Thank you guys so much once again. I am your boy Cakes Da Killa, and this is my right-hand man, Proper Villains. We did a throwback for you guys, but if you want to tune into any new music, we have a new release coming out called Motherland Volume 222. Stay tuned. All right, shout outs to everybody. Stay safe.
Hi, I'm Imara Jones, and welcome to our conversation, The Road to Liberation, Centering Economic Justice for Black LGBTQ People. We want to start out, of course, by thanking tremendously Cakes Da Killa for that amazing performance. I mean, what else do we expect? But it's always really important for us to embrace artists that are part of our community, and Cakes Da Killa is one of the leading artists in our community, and just thrilled to be able to have their artistry as a part of tonight. Now we're gonna move on to this really important conversation about the role of economic justice as a part of LGBTQ liberation. We have to have this conversation because we know that so much of the injustice for Black people in this country, all of the injustice goes back to a fundamental economic injustice, and that is slavery. And so there's no way that we as Black people or as LGBTQ people are going to be fully free until we have an economy that works for us. For those who don't know me, as again, my name is Imara Jones, and even though right now I run an organization called TransLash Media, which focuses on the stories and our humanity as trans people, specifically trans people of color, at this time of backlash. I actually started out my career as a journalist working and reporting on economic justice. And it's a subject that is close to my heart because my graduate degree is also in economics. So kind of not a well-known thing about me is that I am an economist, and actually a lot of my work and career was around these issues. And so anytime I get the chance to be able to talk about economics and how it ties into our communities and how we can actually build a fairer society by having a fair economy, I'm always thrilled to be able to have that. And I'm glad that the National Center for Lesbian Rights initiated this conversation, because it's one amongst the rainbow floats and flags and the corporations who suddenly discover our communities during Pride gets lost. But for most of us, it is the issue. So that is what we are going to talk about. And specifically tonight, not only highlighting what the problems are for us, but what the solutions are. And that's why I'm thrilled to be joined tonight on the panel for this amazing discussion. First by Tyrone Hanley, who is the Senior Policy Counsel at the National Center for Lesbian Rights. We're also joined by Kim L. Hunt, who is the Executive Director of Pride Action Tank. Kenyon Farrow, who is the Managing Director of Advocacy and Organizing at Prep for All. And the one, the only, Angelina Nordstrom, who is president of the Chicago LGBTQ Workers Center. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. Thrilled to be able to have this conversation. I'm so excited to get to talk about things I don't normally get to talk about. So Tyrone, why don't we start with you, since this is being put together by the National Center. Can you talk about why you believe that it was important to have this panel on the intersection of racial and economic justice for our community, and what the center's thinking is around it right now?
Sure. Thank you, Imara, for being here and moderating this conversation. It's just so exciting to always be in conversation with you. I really do appreciate and respect the work that you do. And to my panelists, co-panelists, thank you for being here. I'm so excited to have this conversation. So NCLR, we understand that LGBTQ liberation is not possible unless we're including the issues that the people who are most impacted by violence and discrimination in our society. And so we know that when you look at our community, the LGBTQ community, that the people who experience some of the worst aspects of homophobia and transphobia are people who are Black, which is not surprising because obviously, we are at the intersection of so many different issues of ableism, racism, sexism, classism. And so that we know that if we really want to deal with these issues, we really have to take these issues head on. And so we need to be explicit that these are our issues as a community, so that we know that racial and economic justice are at the center of LGBTQ liberation work. And so we're so excited to be doing this work. We've been, engaged in economic justice work since the founding of our organization. And I'm just really excited that we're getting to place more so as a movement that we recognize how all these issues are an issue for our communities.
Angelina, can you talk a little bit about what you see as some of the biggest issues in our community are around economic justice? What are some of the things that you would prioritize as sort of the main issues? And I think that, specifically, we know that our community overall is disadvantaged, but for example, for Black trans people have a twice as high unemployment rate as Black people overall, and Black people overall have twice as high unemployment rate as white people, which means that Black trans people have an employment rate that's 4 times higher than for white people and the overall population. So I'm wondering what for you springs up as some of the key issues.
Thank you for asking that question. So one factor is unfortunately the fact that, yes, although there may be laws depending on where people live that protect people who are trans or protect people who are LGBT, QIA from being discriminated in the workplace, it seems to realistically not be nearly as easy to enforce because it's always a your word against mine situation. And even though an employer can have this mindset of, I cannot stand trans people, I cannot stand this person because they're good, and they can do whatever they want to that person who they can't stand, it's really a matter of just knowing that you're not alone in that particular situation. And there are many cities that don't have like particular resources, such as access to a human rights commission, or they may not have a statute that protects them in the workplace as a person who identifies as gay or who identifies as lesbian, or even someone who identifies as trans. And even if there is a statute, it is a lot harder to prove that. And God forbid if you don't have that statute, then you have to rely on the EEOC, and what they tend to do is a little more scaled back compared to if there were to be a state statute or a county statute. So one of the things that I have been, very instrumental in implementing as part of the Chicago LGBTQ Workers Center is to launch a workers' rights hotline. And this is a Chicagoland-based resource. That's to connect community members with resources where they can receive support as they're navigating workplace discrimination and workplace oppression. And although it's a start, it's a great start towards ensuring that, yeah, there is a way you can navigate this. And there is a way where justice can be achieved. And I mean, obviously, one of the other aspects of not receiving that sense of, being fairly treated is when you're not hired at a job because you're trans, or not being hired because you're queer. And again, it goes back to that whole cue of, well, is your word against mine? I didn't say that I wasn't hiring you because you're queer. However, there's only so many other reasons there could be, especially when a person actually has all of the required and preferred qualifications that's listed on a job description, and yet they're being passed over for someone who has more privilege and do not even possess half of the required qualifications for a job. So a good start to me, in addition to like either having a hotline or having a list of resources available at some of our LGBTQ friendly and competent organizations, would be to also not be afraid to assimilate together to create your own union within your own organization, or a worker center within your own organization, because unions are not as common as they used to be. And although they're not as common as they used to be, they can be very vital to ensure that your rights as a worker is protected. So those are a couple of things that I, can start off by mentioning, but yeah, so.
Yeah, I think those are really important points, and we'll come back to some solutions later, but I think that, it's really important to think about the impact of employment discrimination, as you mentioned. One of the things I think is key, kind of as you touched upon, Tyrone, is the role of transphobia in employment. So for example, according to the NCTE survey of trans people, 1 out of 3 trans people who has a job has had to leave that job in the last year due to on-the-job harassment. So if every year you're having to leave your job because you're being harassed, and these are for people who are employed, then that means that there's no way that you're going to be able to be in line for promotions. You're not going to be in line for salary increases. You're not going to be in line for all of these things because you're constantly having to start over, constantly having to readjust from job to job due to discrimination. So I think that for our communities, the link between hostility, transphobia, homophobia, and economic opportunity is really, really real. And it's one that we can't lose sight of. Kim, how about for you? What are some of the problems that you see for our community when it comes to economic justice and some of the barriers to equality?
Oh, such a big question. First of all, let me say I am really grateful to be here. Thank you to NCLR for opening up the space for us to have this conversation and for inviting me to be on this panel full of brilliant folks. Yeah, the question that you asked really is the root of it, right? And of course, we can say that the big issue is racism and anti-Blackness, right? But we also know that as queer and trans people, there is this additional layer on top of that. And so, as has been pointed out earlier, some of the outcomes in terms of economically, where we find LGBTQ folks is even different from the broader Black population, let alone white cisgender straight folks. And I will say that, you know, even having this conversation right now is long overdue. I remember, Kenyon, when you were at Queers for Economic Justice, and when that organization folded, it left a really big hole among LGBTQ organizations, even looking at the issue of economic justice. One of the things that we focus on at Pride Action Tank is bringing many people to the table to not just discuss issues, but really to dream and co-create new futures, right? So a lot of that has to do with people's ability to thrive, however you define it, and even being free to thrive. And so we look at financial stability and well-being. We look at the way that we name our communities and the recognition that we need for how we structure family, as well as safety and security of folks and what that means to them. And it's all interrelated. And one of the big pieces that's super important to economic stability is housing. Oh my God, if you don't have stable housing, you know, it's hard to have good health outcomes. It's hard to concentrate on education. It's hard to hold a job. It's hard to do all the things that really point to stability and justice when it comes to economics. Yet we've had this opportunity as a country, as a world, to really focus on housing first in the midst of a pandemic. And as we get closer to getting on the other side of this, whatever that means, we see that a lot of the ways that government, even in some of the worst places in the United States, have shown up and started in terms of providing stable housing is beginning to slowly creep away as folks sort of get back to normal. So I think this pandemic has taught us a lot about how we need to better hold and take care of folks, and what economic justice can look like in terms of providing the stability that folks need to move from, you know, just surviving and getting by day to really being in a mind frame and mindset of even thinking about the future. And that's really hard for a lot of folks right now.
We've spoken about employment opportunity, housing, on-the-job discrimination, and the way that links to poverty. And then also the uneven patchwork and the uneven enforcement of laws, since according to the Supreme Court last year, it is now technically illegal to discriminate against us in employment discrimination, but we know that there is an uneven application of those discriminatory and discrimination laws depending on where you live. So in addition to those issues, Kenyon, what leaps out for you? And I would also be curious as to what your thoughts are in connection to this. What is the unfinished business, do you think, that lies in our community with regards to economic justice, is highlighted by, as Kim pointed out, the ending of Queers for Economic Justice. So what are some of the major issues now that you see, and what's some of the unfinished business overall in our movement when it comes to the intersection of racial and economic justice for LGBTQ people?
Thank you for the question, Imara. I'm really glad to be here amongst friends and comrades and kind of chosen family, I think. Some of us have known each other over the long haul.
Fellow Midwesterners.
Right, fellow Midwesterners. I'm here in Cleveland, Ohio. I think for me, one of the kind of key elements of economic justice that I think often doesn't get talked about from an economic justice framework is healthcare. And when we certainly look at, access to healthcare as it pertains to Black LGBTQ folks and what kinds of health disparities exist due to the lack of access to healthcare, HIV is at the top of the list. And so, when we look at, data published, by the CDC, I think 4 years ago, showing that if current trends continue, Black, gay and bisexual and queer men, 1 in 2 will become HIV positive in their lifetime, right? If we look at also data looking at Black trans women, that over 40% of Black trans women in the United States are currently living with HIV. And then when we look at the, kind of things that we know that are tools that we have to end the epidemic, we have incredibly good medication in terms of for people who are living with HIV, to the extent that we know that, if a person is taking their medications and becomes what we call virally suppressed or undetectable, that they can't transmit the virus sexually to partners, even if they're not using condoms or, other kind of barrier of protection. And similarly, we have, a couple of drugs available to take to prevent HIV, right, which we call pre-exposure prophylaxis or PrEP. But we have great medications that are entering into racist, sexist, transphobic systems that also hate poor people. And so we have a situation where the benefits of those medications have not been equally borne out. So we still see that, Black, gay, and bisexual men and trans women are still less likely to be virally suppressed if they're living with HIV, which has everything to do with access to healthcare. And we even see that with PrEP being available, and we're now in 9 years, next year will be 10 years since PrEP was approved by the FDA, we still see very, 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 very low rates of uptake among Black folks in general, but certainly, Black, queer, and trans people who are most at risk in the epidemic. And so I think that is a primary issue. And then even when you look at some of the data that looks at what healthcare access has done, so recent study looked at the states that have expanded Medicaid through the Affordable Care Act. And those states that expanded Medicaid have seen reductions in HIV rates, and in some cases across all groups. So New York State last year published data, first time since the beginning of the epidemic that they've been counting, that they were able to see reductions in HIV rates among Black, gay, and bisexual men and among Black trans women, right? So we know that access to healthcare really matters, right? In terms of keeping people who are living with HIV healthy and able to, not transmit the virus, and then folks who are most at risk for HIV, which are also our folks from contracting HIV, but we don't have those systems. And the states that haven't expanded Medicaid are also some of the states that have the highest HIV rates, like Florida, Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama, et cetera. South Carolina. So those are some of the issues. I think what we have is some unfinished business. I think certainly is healthcare access writ large. And I wish that we had more sort of national Black organizations that were really focused on mobilizing Black communities around healthcare in the same way that we see around police violence and murders, right? Given the impact that it has on our actual mortality. And then as Kim mentioned, in terms of the work that Queers for Economic Justice was doing, which closed because funders no longer saw fit to fund it. I mean, that was really the sole reason that QEJ did not survive when it closed in 2013. And I think that we still have an issue where more often than not, people still believe that actually being an LGBT person makes one sort of more economically advantaged, right? Or that we don't have children, or that we have expendable incomes. And in many ways, this still permeates how people see our communities. And this is even true in the Black community. I have conversations with, Black organizers and folks doing other social justice work who actually really don't see Black queer and trans people as, and seeing the homophobia and transphobia as actually part of what is driving us actually to be more economically disadvantaged than we are advantaged, right? And so I think we still have work to do to continue to tell those stories and to help situate homophobia and transphobia as concerns for Black people, and particularly in terms of our, kind of economic viability.
Yeah, I think you've led us to a really important place. And I think that, this is a really complicated area, this intersection of perception of our community versus the reality of our community, and how that drives the way that people think that our issues are important or not, and then need to be resourced, and not only nonprofit, but just overall. One of the issues, right, is that people see, when they hear LGBTQ, they basically think gay, right? Whenever you say those words. And then when they think gay, they think white gay, right? They think you're white and gay. And the stereotype of white and gay people that has been fed by shows like Queer Eye, that's been fed by shows like Will and Grace, that's been fed the stereotype, even in Sex and the City, right? The stereotype of gay people, and specifically white gay people, is that white gay people are advantaged economically, right? And that gay people then are advantaged economically. When the reality for Black LGBTQ people writ large is that Black LGBTQ people are more disadvantaged than Black people overall, economically, right? So whatever we think is the economic condition of Black people, Black LGBTQ people is even harsher. And the more you leave away, the further away you are from a cis identity, the worse that gets, right? So all these things are compounded. And I'm wondering if you all can just talk a little bit about that issue, that people don't think that our community has economic problems, and in the way that that's fed by media. I think the only show that I think that represents that is popular and represents LGBTQ people who are poor is Pose, right? And disadvantaged, and in sex work, and all of these other things. But we end the show in the 90s, where suddenly everybody is upper middle class, right? So like, even that is idea that like the closer we come to our time, the better their economic position has gotten. And by the time we get close to our time, they're all, flush. They're all doing well. So I don't know who wants to lead off on this, but I think this is an important place for us to go. And of course, ties into my work around trans storytelling, and the importance of that is kind of this collision between the reality and the perception of our lives. And I don't know who wants to start there.
I can take that. Oh, good. You want to go, Kim?
I was going to say, I'm happy to pop in, but I can also wait for you, Tyrone.
I want to hear what you have to say.
Let's go.
Okay.
Kim, and then Tyrone.
Awesome. So I'll back up and say that one of the things I do in my quote unquote spare time is co-host a storytelling show that's been going on in one of the bars in Boys Town in Chicago for the last it'll be 7 years in August. And so those stories are so important for folks' formation of identity and representation, knowing that that's not all, but seeing folks who look like you, think like you, perhaps act like you, is super important, particularly in a world where you are taught that you are less than. I turned 59 this year, which it's hard for me to believe, but the gray hair is really showing it though. And when And when I was growing up, it wasn't unusual for folks to sort of organize their whole evening around the appearance of a Black person on TV. It was an event, right? And even if you didn't have a TV, you made arrangements to be at somebody's house who had a TV so you could see this. And it was important to see that, those rare glimpses of a Black person on television. And in that case, they were absolutely representing the race because they just weren't seen very often. And because there were so few, the story that could be told was super, super narrow, right? And the stories and the ways to express those stories we see is still narrow, even though we're seeing more Black and Black queer and trans folks on TV. But we're still experiencing those instances of the first Black fill in the blank. Whether it's TV, whether it's some other aspect of life. And I love seeing us, even when I'm disappointed by the character. I wish we were in a heart space in this country where the appearance of one person or two person wasn't representative of the whole race, but just that story. It's tough I think about folks and I hear stories of folks who are in very isolated places in this country. And even though I'm in a big city like Chicago, there are folks who are isolated even within their neighborhoods, their households. And them seeing these folks is important. For me, seeing folks on television who look like me does not carry the same weight that it used to, because I recognize it as a story. But when you look at the symbolism of it, it can be good or bad, right? And the lesson that I'm learning over and over again is the power behind the camera as well. That is super important to get our stories and all the nuances on the screen or whatever the platform may be, but also recognizing that one character is not going to represent the entire magical being of our Blackness. And so holding both those things at the same time for me has become relatively easy as a 59-year-old, but is not necessarily the case as a younger person. And, now I'm feeling the responsibility as a person who has been out for a generation or so at this point to also supplement the stories that folks are seeing on television with my one-on-one conversations as well as other appearances such as this. So it's a big responsibility whether you're on the screen or you're in person sharing your story.
Thank you for that. So Tyrone, can you talk a little bit about, take us back to this intersection between economic justice and storytelling, the way in which the perception and the portrayal of the economic condition of our community can collide with the reality and that interplay. So if you can talk about that intersection, that would be really helpful.
Sure, thank you for that question. I think for me, how I approach this is telling my own story as someone who grew up poor outside of Chicago and who struggle a lot with the shame of being poor, like to the point, like I came out in college, 18 years old, but I didn't tell anyone about that I was poor. Like it took me a couple of years to get to a place emotionally and mentally where I felt okay saying like, this is my situation, because I found an opportunity to remake myself. Because as someone who grew up in the 80s and 90s, like I digested all the things I was hearing about poor people, particularly Black people, the welfare queens. Like my mom was someone who intentionally did not work because she wanted to be at home to raise us as a lesbian mother, because she knew that by being there at home with us, she can really give us a foundation that would build for success. I know that if she had not taken that time off from work, I would not have the ability that I have today to really thrive in this world. And so it really, I think a part of it is, in saying that we need to tell our stories, I want to let folks who like me, who struggle with the shame of being poor, that like that is real. Like, because society constantly tells you that you're worthless, that there's something wrong with you. And it wasn't really until I studied sociology and I discovered, like, oh my God, there are these systems. That's the reason what's happening. Because as a child, I saw my mom struggling. I love my mom. My mom was like 100% there for me. Like, she encouraged my dolls I want to play with. She made me a Catwoman out for Halloween one year. Like, my mom like came out at a very early age in the early 1990s as a Black lesbian. I'm like, who does that? Like, but like at the same time, like I still struggled, like, you know, in terms of like accepting myself. And I know how difficult it was. I know how hard it was. Like when my friends, my white middle-class friends would drop me off at home, how I was so embarrassed, not because I didn't love my family, but I just knew that like what being in the Section 8 housing meant and like how people understood us. Like they called where we live New Jack City. I don't know how many people are familiar, but it was like a movie in the early 1990s, very popular in the Black community. But anyway, like they would call a place New Jack. And that was a part of, I think, the shame. I remember feeling so angry when people were like describe where we lived that way, because that's not how I experienced it. It was my home. Like I grew up in a community of love. My mom talks about, yeah, we may have been poor financially, but it was a community of love. And it wasn't until I was finally fully able to heal from that shame of growing up poor that I was able to once again remember what it felt to grow up in an interracial poor community. Now, I grew up with Black folks who were poor, white folks who were poor, Mexicans who were poor, Puerto Ricans who were poor. So I've seen firsthand how poverty impacts people across all lines. And so like, that's how I approach this work, because those are my people. And so I feel like I'm now at a place in my life. I'm so grateful, like, you know, the tone that my mom set for my own life and in terms of just being who you are. The fact that I'm at an organization like NCLR, which has been 110% behind me in talking about my own journey and my own experience in poverty, and really entering spaces like anti-poverty, anti-hunger spaces, and LGBT organization, particularly in the mainstream space, and saying like, poverty isn't our issue. Like, you need to care about this. You know, there was a time when I was really frustrated with both movements. I'm like, why are you not talking about our people? I think in part is that misperception that we're all well off. So that is a real thing, even in the advocacy space. And it wasn't until that I was able to introduce the work NCLR is doing, the fact that Williams and CAP and other organizations have released really important data on LGBT data, which is a reason why we need to do a better job collecting data on poverty and LGBTQ issues. But also means that we have to show up, because it wasn't until I started showing up, NCLR showing up, a lot of these organizations were talking about LGBTQ people when it comes to poverty and hunger. And also I was on the LGBTQ side of things. I was like, you know what? I'm tired of waiting for these organizations to get their shit together. I'm just going to go ahead and create a new space. And I'm so grateful to Urvashi Vad and her help in terms of getting it, establishing the National LGBTQ Anti-Poverty Action Network, because I know that we need to be in this fight. And I'm so grateful for that space that we created, because it has allowed us to begin conversation, for example, the Biden administration, to get them to understand that poverty is an LGBTQ issue. And if you care about issues of racial and economic justice, you need to be talking about LGBTQ poverty, and particularly how it impacts Black people.
Yeah, I think all of that is really essential. I'm wondering if you can just tell us in a real world example in terms of what you have seen about this intersection of race and LGBTQ issues and poverty. Angelina, in Chicago during the worst of COVID, I think that COVID has been a real life example for us of who gets impacted, how they're impacted, the degree to which certain communities are insulated versus others. And so I'm wondering, from your experience, what have been your observations about the impact on Black queer people of COVID in Chicago?
One particular scenario that I have witnessed is actually, believe it or not, but this month makes a year since I was laid off from my job. For many people who were laid off from their jobs around this time last year, it was due to the pandemic. The reason that I was laid off from my job was not due to the pandemic. It was due to budgetary reasons. It just so happened that the pandemic accelerated what was inevitable on their end. And I did not speak about this prior to now. So this will be my first time sharing a sense of true testimony, so to speak. So when I was laid off, it of course came out of nowhere. So at this point, we were all laid off for maybe two to 4 weeks. And then the organization that I was previously with began bringing people back. Now, at this point, I'm already part of the LGBTQ Worker Center, and that's due to a lot of the workplace disparities that I was facing at this job. It wouldn't have been necessarily to a point where I would just say, okay, we need to unionize, although I really should have tried. However, what it did was, despite being laid off, the Worker Center really went to bat for me from that moment. And I was empowered to lead. I was following, starting out. And starting out, I was instrumental in the culmination and the launch of this workers' rights hotline that we have here in Chicago. And being laid off, knowing that had I not had access to the Worker Center when I did, I will probably be first in line to need a resource like that. Although I did see that as an experience. Where have there been many Black queer people who have been laid off? Absolutely. Do I know any personally? Not really, not necessarily. I have not really heard of anyone else who was just laid off their job due to the pandemic specifically. But have I seen other Black queer people being laid off of work? Yes, and it is a very painful experience to witness, because it's like, prior to myself being laid off, I saw a Black queer woman being laid off at the first of the year. And this is the same job that I was at. And it was baffling because, yeah, they gave the same reason, which is budgets. You know, was this place in a deficit at that point? Absolutely. But the focus on laying off certain people who are most likely to face the disparities and to face the sense of struggle and the sense of barely existing and not knowing if you're going to exist the next day or where your meal will come from. It's not even just baffling, but it is quite negligent, because it's like what someone said earlier. There's this theory that Black people are well off, and that is far from the truth. In fact, I believe that was just something that was repeated in one's mind just to get rid of that sense of guilt that those who are privileged should know that they should have. I will say that since then, I've been focused so much more on my own advocacy work. Now, have I returned back to a workplace? No, I haven't. I have not, because being laid off in the way that it took place, and having this employer in the same breath make a post on social media to say Black trans lives matter, and you lay off your only Black trans employee, only says that, you know, when it comes to a workplace, you're not irreplaceable. And as much as I would love to believe and love to share that in real life, and it is true, in real life, we are irreplaceable. But unfortunately, there are spaces where we are replaceable. And then there are many more spaces that are not Black spaces, that are not Black LGBTQ spaces, that are not Black queer spaces, that are not Black trans spaces, where we are especially replaceable. And again, I think that's why I have so much admiration for those who are Black and queer, Black and trans, Black and LGBTQ, who create their own and who are willing to employ community, who are willing to empower community. I took a road less traveled and not want to return back to work due to my own health you know, issues with working within a pandemic. But there's also this whole thing about coping with trauma of being in such a toxic workplace that did not empower Black, workers to really lead. We were not empowered to lead. And I'm sure some people maybe from that place that will be watching this, but we were not empowered to lead. And whether the Black workers at this place are empowered to lead now, I don't know. But what I do know is I've been empowered to lead by the Worker Center. And although it is not considered a job because I'm on a board, I'm on an advisory board. But I guess I had to tap into my spiritual sense of, I'm not going to worry about this anymore. After that first several days, I had to no longer worry about that. I had to focus on, improving the human condition and hope that that higher power would take care of my needs. And so far, those needs have been taken care of to an extent. Will I still want to have some additional opportunities? Absolutely. But I have to cope with that trauma behind being in a place that did not value me and did not value my contributions. And that is a narrative that a lot of Black queer and a lot of Black trans people who work and who are workers have been sharing time and time again. And it's been a narrative that we've been living and still continue to live.
Absolutely. One of the things that we're saying, Kenyon, is the fact that we know that from over the last year, this intersection of economic justice and health for our communities, I think it's laid bare a lot of the structural problems and the lack of structural support for Black queer people, and specifically Black trans people, but Black queer people overall. I mean, from my own reporting and things that we focused on last year, there's so many ways in which COVID impacted our communities, from the fact that they're more likely to have Black queer people in the informal economy, which was hard hit. There are more queer people that are involved in sex work, which is also an area that was really hard hit by the disease. And if you're in those two areas, you may not necessarily have been a part of the formal tax structure. So a lot of the aid that other people were getting, you couldn't get, and you couldn't get access to. So that was a part of it. We know that our communities have a lack of health access, and that was an issue during the pandemic, and has been an issue with respect to vaccines and receiving vaccinations. As we are seeing people try to grapple with that. There was an incredible amount of food insecurity. I mean, the list goes on and on and on, right? So before shutdown, some people were saying, get ready and prepare. But if you're living paycheck to paycheck, you don't have an extra $400 to go out and buy a bunch of groceries to be able to live off of. It's not even a part of your thinking. So for you, what are some of the standouts of this intersection between a health crisis and health and our economic well-being that we have to pay attention to and begin to fix moving forward?
Yeah, thank you. I think that the COVID pandemic, I think, kind of laid a few truths bare about health and how it kind of impacts our community. First and foremost, as I mentioned earlier, the impact of HIV as an epidemic in this country is, without question, Black women and Black trans women at this point, and anybody who can debate me about that, but that is really the height of the crisis as an epidemic at this point. At the same time, one of the few places that actually folks in our community are allowed to work and hopefully be able to build themselves and build skills and be promoted into career paths is in HIV organizations and in public health, right? Those become the places that for a lot of folks, especially if you're coming out of prison, if you have a history of sex work, if you have been homeless, et cetera, where actually in a lot of ways, those experiences are are looked upon as actual assets to be able to work, right, or to be able to benefit. Now, there's a lot of problems in some of that infrastructure, but it can be the entry point into employment for a lot of our folks. But COVID shut all that down, right? So in addition to the just other things that our panelists have talked about in terms of workplace discrimination and the impact of COVID in those ways, but also one of the primary places that many folks in our community are able to actually work. You couldn't do outreach, you couldn't do testing, do HIV testing, you couldn't do linkage to care, you couldn't do all of these things, and so a lot of organizations laid off a lot of their staff, and a lot of those, particularly those frontline staff members, before they got that job, were involved in sex work, were homeless, were dealing with a number of issues that set them up to be vulnerable to HIV in the first place, right? And I think we have yet to see, everybody is sort of at this point predicting that we may potentially see spikes in the epidemic, even in places where we were seeing some success in our communities due to those, due to the shutdown of that care infrastructure. I just want to add one other point, as we were talking about the media earlier, because I think HIV is really kind of important here. And Imara, you mentioned Pose, and I think one of the other kind of key pieces when we talk about media representation, especially in the last 10 years, where there's been such a kind of a growth of sort of popular culture doing these various sort of remembrances of the first wave of the epidemic. So from, all of the documentaries, United in Anger, How to Survive a Plague, about, ACT UP, as kind of a central movement organization, films about Larry Kramer and a remake of The Normal Heart and these sort of things, but many of which left our stories completely out of it. And it was almost as though Black queer people did not do anything in the epidemic except die. And so what I was really happy to see Pose really sort of both center poor Black, queer, and trans people figuring out ways to live, right, despite the epidemic, and to thrive. But also, even in one of the things that for me showed up in the depiction was, they sort of used ACT UP sort of demonstrations, right, as kind of ways to talk about the activism happening at that time. But we also know that ACT UP had a lot of, problems in terms of race, right, and diversity in that particular organization. And some of the things that were just more likely, right? So I watched that and thought, well, it probably would have been true that Pray Tell or some of those young men would have gone to GMAD, which is Gay Men of African Descent, which was founded a year before ACT UP in New York City. And at the time, they were a radical organization. They marched in the Harlem Day Parade with bottles and rocks thrown at them in the late 1980s and early 1990s, right? And so, and founded other countries, which was a writing group. And so I think, there was, to me, some pieces of that history or that, Marlon Riggs and Essex Temple and their work, and the fact that Tongues Untied as a documentary was shown on PBS and became a national story because the Republicans tried to use it as a way to defund the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and the National Endowment of the Arts. And so to me, when I think about also how the media sort of shapes who we see as change agents in social justice movements, is really, really critical. That we tell and begin to use the media, really tell full stories about, who we are, not both as folks in the community, but a lot of our folks who actually are poor, queer, and trans folks actually actively did things that mattered both in their local communities and also in the national discussion around the epidemic and our folks.
We've spoken about how COVID has laid bare a lot of these structural issues. We touched upon housing, health, employment discrimination. Ironically, we didn't talk about schools, but I think schools are really important because for me, the issues of poverty in our community are a pipeline issue. And so, for example, schools we know are hostile places for LGBTQ people. And Therefore, if school is hostile, it's not a surprise that you either drop out of school or don't do well in school, which then immediately begins to limit a whole host of economic choices that you have that ripple throughout your life on top of all of the things that we're talking about. So we haven't even really spoken about the importance of schools as a tool for economic liberation and justice, and how schools are not set up for us to be able to thrive, which then sets in motion a lifetime of marginalization that's compounded by all these other types of issues that we spoke about. So there are many structural issues and problems. So we've spent a lot of time on those in really important ways. And so I'm wondering, as we begin to end this conversation, if we can end on the things that we can do. So for each of you, I want to hear what you believe are the solutions are to end economic marginalization for LGBTQ people and to bring about economic justice. And I think we'll start with you, Kim.
Well, I'll start by saying that, sort of a fundamental issue is to see people experiencing poverty or living in poverty as human beings. And I think, we've all pointed to sort of the invisibility of folks who are low income, and that invisibility has a huge impact in terms of us even looking for solutions. And I'll also say that folks who are living in poverty, we have to create space for them to name the solutions that they need, name the goals that they have. I think a lot of times we, even as folks who have experienced poverty and may be in a different place economically, tend to want to swoop in with solutions. And I think we can all name structural issues that need to change. But for me, and the reason I do what I do in terms of co-founding Pride Action Tank is to create those spaces, because I wasn't seeing that kind of collaboration with community, naming what the solutions could be, and then using resources to actually move those ideas and opportunities for continued engagement and mobility happen on a consistent basis. So for me, I'm always going to bring it back to the community that's impacted by the issue, and making sure that we are creating space to hear their voices and be directed by their voices.
How about you, Angelina?
Okay, so in addition to a sense of some of the resources that I mentioned earlier, great solutions to me that should, be accessible to our community should include, of course, fair housing. Fair housing is one. It is very unlikely to be able to pursue economic justice or a sense of even economic stability if you're unable to have that sense of fortitude to rediscover peace every day. Another solution is having access to education, as well as financial aid for education, because universities are expensive. And I personally know that from my own experience of currently being in school. There can be many opportunities that come from attending college. It may not be for everyone, but for those who are interested, that should definitely be a resource and a solution that should be available, especially for those who are Black and queer or Black and trans. And most importantly, empowerment, a sense of empowering our community, empowering those who may not see it for themselves, see anything beyond just the environment of which they're a product. Knowing that you can be more than where you came from. You can also be in control of your destiny. You can also dream big and go beyond of where you think you've been and apply it to where you want to go. Having that sense of thought and having that sense of manifestation of where you want to be can be very essential to a person who will want to be able to apply that and go to school or have their own business and venture off into entrepreneurship, or even to just pursue anything that is under the sun, and the possibilities are endless. So those are some solutions that I would say should be accessible for, our community.
Great, thank you. Kenyon?
Thank you. Yeah, so I think for me, one of the solutions is healthcare, healthcare, healthcare. So, and I will tell you my prejudice. I am a Medicare for all activist. I'm all in on it. And I think that is the baseline of what everyone should have, in this country. And there's a, bill in Congress that is, purported to do as much. But also, if, scaling back from there, certainly we can do work to, push the southern states to finish, or the states that have not expanded Medicaid, most of them are in the South, to expand Medicaid to help in the sort of coverage gap. But we also know that there are people, even in the states that have expanded Medicaid, that make too much money for Medicaid and not enough to qualify for the health exchanges, or where it's still out of their budgets, right, to be able to afford. So we still have folks. I just met somebody here in Cleveland who wanted access to healthcare, but made too much money for Medicaid, couldn't qualify. So, we have to fix those systems. We know the Biden administrations, or at least there's some folks who are thinking about creating a kind of federal public option program to do as much to try to help the states, folks who are in states that haven't expanded Medicaid or are still in the coverage gap to be addressed. And then lastly, I think specifically where poor people are concerned and where our social safety net and healthcare programs, including the Ryan White program for people who are living with HIV, I think there has to be some reform. What often happens for poor people is you have to then spend a whole lot more time dealing with bureaucratic nonsense. So you have to constantly submit income verification, provide check stubs or pay stubs, or all these different things sometimes every quarter, every 6 months, every year, either to Medicaid or to Ryan White or whatever. And so we don't often talk about how that actually discourages people, or people fall out of the system because of the ways in which the administrative piece of much of our social safety net care programs, and I'm just talking about, kind of medical and healthcare related things, is actually very cruel and dehumanizing to poor people, and forces them into situations where they have to constantly justify being poor enough to access, a range of different things to take care of their needs. And so I think we have to really pay attention to the kind of meta structural pieces, like, who pays for healthcare, but also the manner in which people enter those systems so that they're actually treated with dignity and not put in a position where they're made to prove, how poor they are in order to access the things that they need.
Perfect. And lastly, to you, Tyrone, what do you think in terms of the solutions that we need to embrace?
So in terms of the solution, I think we need to embrace in terms of address the experience that Black LGBTQ people experience who are living in poverty, is ultimately the economic system itself. The Williams Institute released a report called Pathways to Poverty, and it found the main pathway to poverty for LGBTQ people was childhood poverty. So if we want to address LGBT poverty, we're just going to have to address poverty itself. And so that means we actually need to look at our economic system and how, first of all, it is a tool of white supremacy, as the 1619 Project, demonstrates for us. And so that means we really need to rethink about how do we have an economy that can be so wealthy and there can still be poverty? And that's because the economic system we live in produces poverty. And so we need to rethink how our economy is actually structured, that's actually people and environmental centered. What good is profit if people can't have enough food to eat, don't even have adequate housing, can't even get decent transportation or education? That to me is a form of an out of control economy that's not actually meant for our well-being. And so that means that we need to, first of all, reinvest in a society that that actually treats housing as a human right, that makes sure that all people have access to food, that people have access to quality healthcare, as Kenyon was saying, that people have, decent transportation so they can get around, that people actually have time to take leisure and to soothe themselves and spend time with their families and their hobbies, because we are worth it. It also means that we have to divest from violent institutions like the police and the military and the immigration enforcement machine, because those things are actively hurting our communities, and particularly Black communities and immigrant communities. I think also it's really important that we think about who's paying for these things, right? We know that the wealthy and corporations are making unprecedented amounts of money in this moment. There's no reason why they can't pay more money in taxes to ensure that we have housing for all people, that we have healthcare for all people, that everyone gets access to food. There's no way that we can do this if we make the choice. The thing that's frustrating for me as someone who grew up poor and had to deal with the shame of poverty was that I now know in my adulthood that poverty is a choice that our society has made. We need to make a different choice. And I think a part of what's going to require us to do as an LGBTQ movement, as a person who's working at an LGBT organization, is that we need to rethink our relation with corporate America. Like, we give awards and 100% on indexes who corporations, while, have been very great in terms of helping us in our fight for non-discrimination protections, but on the other hand, are destroying our planet, are intentionally making it harder for workers to be able to thrive. So we can't say on one hand, we care about our community, then are giving a platform from these very entities that are causing harm to our own community. What is that? We can't continue down this path. And at some point, we're going to need to reconcile with that, because we are actively producing harm in our own communities. And so I think we as a movement need to do some serious introspection. And so I also think that's going to require us to work across movements, and including racial lines. Again, as someone who, when growing up poor, poverty impacts us all. At the end of the day, the actual things that we're going to need to do is going to really help everyone. I think there's this notion that this movement like Black Lives Matter, that address the issues that Black communities, including LGBTQ folks, that means going to leave other people out in the dark. No, that is a mindset of white supremacy, that is us versus them. That is not the case. What we're calling for is a world where we all can thrive. And that obviously, starting from a place of the experience of Black people, because at the end of the day, the people who experience the brunt of the violence in our community, particularly in this country, are Black people. So if we're addressing the various systems that are causing those things, that's going to help everyone. And so I think that is something that we need to all collectively buy into, because I think that's the only way forward. And that's the work that, I'm committed to. I know that folks here are committed to, and I'm really excited because I know that we will win, because there's no other way.
Well, thank you so much for that. And thank you so much to everyone on the panel for a wide-ranging discussion about the problems, where we are right now, and the solutions to moving forward. I think that these issues have to be front and foremost for our community during Pride, because we will never be able to reach full liberation without economic justice and a full rethink of how we achieve that. And so conversations like this are important, and we need to have more of them. I want to encourage everyone this Thursday, my project's TransLash. You can find us at TransLash Media across all of the social media platforms. We'll be releasing a new limited series called The Anti-Trans Hate Machine, A Plot Against Equality, where we examine in part the role of economics and our economic system in funding the billionaires who repress us and who are targeting us. And so make sure that you be on the lookout for that. We are wishing all of you a fantastic Pride as we go into kind of the last weekend of that. Hopefully you'll be able to still be standing and upright on Monday. But even if not, take the day off if you can. But regardless, have a safe Pride, a wonderful Pride, and make sure that we keep in mind the members of our community who are struggling and who are facing an uphill battle, understanding that Pride is for them too. So thank you all so much, and thank you to the National Center for Lesbian Rights for having this conversation. Thank you all so much.